Hi everyone, this is a tutorial for challenge 2 from the Little Book of Algorithms. I'm going to essentially go through and code it as a kind of a walkthrough, as I know that file writing is one of the trickier topics. Many of you, I would say that you should really handwrite these algorithms as opposed to coding them straight in Python to start with, because that's the method that you'd be using in your exam. You can then try and code them in Python afterwards to check that they work. And then if they don't work, then you can check the answer at the back. But I thought it'd be useful to do the walkthrough so you can kind of see my thought process as I go along and how I decompose the question. I'm going to switch the font to Helvetica because it's a bit more readable, like the previous typeface that you see in the book, which is, I don't know what it is, it's like some kind of custom font that I have. I think it's called something like DK Yellow Sunshine. Is less readable on the screen anyway. So it says write a subprogram. So straight away you know that it's going to be a function or a procedure because it's a subprogram which generates a username for a teacher based on their first name and surname. And you can see that these are declared as parameters here. So they're going to be expecting arguments, so things to be passed in. And the format should be their surname followed by the first letter of their first name. The program should check to see if the username already exists, and if so, unique surname should be generated by appending a hash symbol. E.g., if a teacher joins a school called Winnie Lau, because Lau W, William Lau, already exists, you would actually have Lau W and then a hash at the end. And if there was a third teacher who also had first initial of W, like Wakil Lau, for example, then you would have Lau W hash hash. All right, okay, so in here then, let's also get off these spell checks so that we just ignore all. I'm sure there's a quick way to turn off spell check, but I think it's a bit with you, isn't it? Spelling options. Can I just ignore actually spell this time? Yeah, okay. And that just makes it more readable as well. Cool. Right. Bit of distraction. Okay, so the first thing then is that it says for the username it's going to be the full surname and then the first name. So we're just going to take the surname, or the last name is the name of the parameter, and we're going to concatenate it using plus, and then we're going to take the first name. Now because we only want the first character, we can index that with a 0, because in Python, when you've got a name, let's say for example your name is Abdul, the first character is known as 0, and then this is 1, and this is 2, this is 3, this is 4. So in Python you can just say first name 0 and it'll just slice off the first character. In your exam when you're doing this, you may find that OCR use this function called substring, and they might do substring 0, 1, which means start at element 0 and slice off one character. But you can write in Python in your exam. I'd encourage you to do so as well. So last name plus first name 1. That's if Python is your native language, obviously. Okay, then we need to open the file, and the file up here is called users.txt, so we'll put that in speech marks, users.txt. And then in terms of the mode, because we're not actually writing to this file, we'll open it in read mode, so we'll put an R there for that. Okay, if you wanted to format that better, I mean, I hope that you'd be handwriting this, that it would go there. Okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to read in our file, and Python will usually treat text files as strings because inside a text file it would ordinarily be a string. However, what we can do is we could get Python function to evaluate what's in that text file and try to make sense of it. And in this case, you can see that it's actually a 2D list because you've got a square bracket, that makes it a list, a double square bracket, it's essentially a 2D list, right? So we can get it to eval the file that we're reading in, and we're going to do that here by doing users underscore file dot read, and that's a function, so we've got open bracket, close bracket. So we read the whole file and we evaluate it, and that essentially reads in our 2D list called usernames. Then we close the file. It then says we need to check if that username already exists, and the best way to do that is to iterate through our 2D array, or 2D list, sorry. So we're going to say for count in range len of usernames, because that's the name of our 2D list, we need to check if the username already exists. So we're going to go through our usernames and we're going to check on element 0. So the iterator is count. So this would be count of 0, this would be count of 1, this would be count of 2, and that would be the end of our list. But within that, you've also got these sublists. So this would be 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, right? So we're going to take if usernames count 0 is equal to the username, then we need to give them a new username, don't we? So because if it already exists, then we need to concatenate in the hash symbol. The username becomes username plus hash as such, and that's to concatenate a character at the end. That shouldn't be an H, it should be a hash. Okay, and then at the end, if it was a function, we'd be returning the username. Okay, so let's just go that through from the top to bottom. So we've got our function called generate username. It takes in arguments. One argument goes into the first name parameter. The second argument goes into the last name parameter. And then the username is generated by taking the last name and the first character. My bad, there's a mistake there. The first character of the first name. So that is 0, because the first character is 0. This is why we check over our programs, because you're going to find mistakes in them, and plus you won't have an IDE to code in your exam, so you have to reread your code. That's the way that we run the program. We kind of run it in our head. We open our file called users file. Well, we've given it the alias of users file, but the real name is users.txt, and we're opening in read mode. We're going to read the whole file, and we're going to evaluate that into usernames. We close our file, because any file we open, we have to close it. Then we loop through usernames, which is now our 2D list that we've evaluated. And if the count, so we start at 0, 1, 2, if the count 0, LBOA, Vega J, Lassamil, is equal to the username, so if it already exists, then we can't have that username because it needs to be unique. So the way we make it unique is by appending or concatenating a hash at the end. Then we return it. All right, okay. So challenge 2 continued is write a program which asks for a teacher's first name and surname. Once again, I'm just going to change all this to Helvetica. I think it's shadows into light, which is a beautiful kind of like handwritten font, but like on the screen it's terrible. So let's just go to Helvetica because it's easy to read, isn't it? Okay, so write a program which asks for a teacher's first name and surname, then demonstrate how you would call this function and generate a username and output this in a meaningful message. So let's just have a variable and we'll call it teacher first. It'll auto-correct it, won't it? Because it's publisher equals input, and we're going to say enter teacher's first name. Now some of you will wonder, well, why did he not call it first name? The reason why is because these are actually different variables. Like teacher first is a different variable. It's a global variable which is readable throughout the whole program, whereas this first name is a local variable which is actually lost as soon as we return the username. You could call this first name, and you could call the teacher surname last name, but the issue with that is that they're actually teacher first and first name are two different memory address locations. You can give them the same name. In Python, it won't complain because one is global, one is local, but generally speaking, in terms of programming, like Python will work it out, but it's not advised, so you should really use different variable names. So here we're going to call this teacher last equals input, enter teacher's surname, and then we're going to call that function. So we're calling generate username with spelling teacher first, which is going to get passed into first name, and then teacher last, which is going to get passed into last name, and eventually this will return the username that's been generated. But unless we store that somewhere, we can't actually use it. So we should really call this like user out. So we'll say user out equals I'm just going to take this space out just so it fits in. User out equals generate username, teacher first, teacher last. And then we can print a meaningful message. So we can say print the teacher's username is, and then we'll use comma to concatenate. That will, when you concatenate with a comma in Python, it leaves a space automatically, whereas if you concatenate with a plus, it won't actually have a space. So in this case, a space will look better, and we'll put the teacher's username is user out. And let's just run through that so you can see what happened. So teacher first is asking them for their first name, it's an input. Teacher last is asking them for their surname. We then declare a variable, and in that variable we're going to store whatever is returned when we call this. So we're calling the function generate username. Teacher first is an argument which gets passed into this parameter. Teacher last is the second argument which gets passed into this parameter, and you can kind of see these parameters. They're essentially local variables or placeholders which accept arguments, they accept values. An analogy might be they're like parking spaces. You have two parking spaces, one called first name, one called last name, and they're waiting for these cars to get parked in. So this is the first car that comes along, so obviously it goes into the first parking space. This is the second car that comes along, so that goes into the second parking space. And then it's used, is returned, and then these local variables are then lost until the function is called again, at which point they can take in new cars, as it were. Okay, so hopefully that explains challenge 2 from the Little Book of Algorithms, and we'll move on to challenge 10 next, because I realise that that's also a tricky one. So I've given you like the comments here which explain it. I'll go through it anyway because file writing is probably one of the trickiest parts of the GCSE. Okay, hope that's useful.